Well, Lars, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good.
Thanks for
Uh, Good.
whoops. Thanks for hopping on, man. Could you just go ahead and give a brief bio and some of the big things you're interested in?
Yeah, so a brief bio. My name's Lars Doucet. I live in Texas, not in any of the big cities, just like in just the central Texas in some medium town. I am a Norwegian citizen and an American citizen. My mom's an immigrant. I was born in Texas, so I kind of got a foot in both countries, which will become relevant later. And then I'm a game developer. That's my actual day job. These days, I do a lot more consulting than actual game development because indie game development is a really, 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 really challenging and difficult business. Consulting is a little safer and more steady, especially when you have three kids like I do. Um, Big things I'm interested in that presumably got me on this podcast is, I'm interested in all the nerdy stuff people are interested in, but particularly I have a particular interest in an economic philosophy known as Georgism, which is really, really obsessed with land. And that has taken on a lot of salience lately because of the housing crisis. I've been into it for over a decade, but it's getting less and less marginal every day and seems like it's starting to break into mainstream thought. I think that's because housing prices, as George predicted, are now going through the roof.
Definitely. Yeah, it's super interesting. God, I've got so many questions for you. I'm trying to think the best attack angle. Um, how about this? Is the rent just too damn high?
Yes, the rent is too damn high. And the really important thing to realize is that it doesn't have to be. Like, one of the things, we'll get into specific questions to get at the heart of this, but I think most people in life know that the rent is too high. But why rent just keeps going up is this kind of mysterious force that a lot of people don't understand. And the basic problem is that you basically have two camps. You have kind of the Marxist camp, and you have I won't call it even capitalist, but I'll just call it status quo because
Yeah,
nobody knows what they mean by the word capitalist.
right.
So the status quo camp is just like, well, that's just the way the market works, which means it's fine, right? And then the Marxist camp, I I feel like is obsessed with treating symptoms rather than getting at the root cause. So that'll be the socialist, the Marxist camp will be for things like public housing and rent control, which I'm not opposed to, by the way. Like no
Yeah,
public housing and rent control, that's fine. But that's a forever treating symptoms kind of thing. Like if you're sick, you need to treat the symptoms and you need to cure the disease.
right.
And Georgism is all about curing the disease that is fundamentally behind housing crises and arguably recessions.
Definitely. This Henry George, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this goes beyond just the, kind of like the NIMBY critique that we just need to build more housing. Isn't that correct?
Yes. So, I mean, obviously, you will find a lot of Georgists in YIMBY town.
Right.
YIMBY, for those in the audience who don't know what that means, NIMBY, NIMBY, means not in my backyard. It's activists who oppose housing and oppose basically building anything more in their block because they know that more housing will increase the supply, which will decrease their home values, right?
Right.
And YIMBYs are the opposite of that. Yes, in my backyard, where people who push for more housing, whether that's public housing or just more market rate housing or any kind of housing.
Right.
And so, yeah, Georgism goes a little bit beyond just standard YIMBYism. Standard YIMBYs will be like, we need some zoning reform and we need to like build houses. Georgists are like absolutely with you on all of that, but we also need to do some other policies.
Right.
And they have a diagnosis for why the problem is there in the first place.
Got it. And what is that diagnosis? What's that kind of next step and that causes, rents to just keep going up?
Well, it's basically all because of land, right? And what do we mean by land? It seems really weird when you create an economic philosophy that's centered on land because in the modern day we've been taught that like we're freed from the land. We're not peasants anymore. Like we're not an agricultural
Right.
economy. Like why does land matter? I work from home. The internet, everything's digital. Nothing is real.
Nothing's real.
Right. Like why does land like what are you even talking about? Who cares about large tracts of land in the 21st
Right.
century? And the answer is that it's kind of the secret force that's sort of behind everything. And land has a couple of properties. First, you can't make it anymore. Like you can't make any more of it. Like just the amount of land that's in the world is what there is, especially if you understand land as locations, right?
Oh, right,
and,
right.
and real estate agents give it away. Location, location, location.
Right. It's
That is
everything.
that is everything, right? It's right there. And so if you do some studies, you'll notice that it's like when you're buying a house, you're not buying like a fraction of the cost of the house is the house. The rest is the land. And it's also insane that houses appreciate in value. Like, think about it. What is a house? It is a built thing. Like, anyone who's owned a house knows it's a freaking money pit, right?
It wears, right? It's like a
Yeah.
car. It just breaks down. It just,
Yeah. It's a depreciating asset. Like, why would that continue to go up and double or even triple in value depending on where you live? It's
Yeah.
because the land is going up in value. And the land goes up in value because you've got a scarce asset. And a scarce asset in a place with a growing population, supply and demand, what's going to happen? It's going to go through the roof. And then we as a society need to decide on a sensible policy for how we're going to allocate our scarce assets. And right now, the way we allocate our scarce assets, all scarce assets that nobody made, by the way, it's
Right.
one thing to be like, one thing about George is that he confuses people because he doesn't take like the hard left or the hard right like aspect. Like, he's very much for like hard work is good and you should deserve to like make money from hard work, and profit is okay. Making money from investments is okay. But what's not okay is making money from other people's hard work in the form of land rent, and he says basically that, like the scarce resources that nobody made and that there's a fixed amount of and that there's a lot of demand for, society should have a policy for how we decide who gets that. And right now it's first come, first serve, right?
Right.
What do you, and when we think about property rights, like, this is mine. Like, why do you get to say that this is mine? If you look back in history, I mean, it's usually because somebody killed someone for it, and your current right to have it is almost like, it boils down to the fact that it's like, if you don't get off, I'll call the police.
Right.
Right. And so it's okay to have property rights. I like property rights, but I think we should take a hard look at scarce things that nobody created. Like, if you created it, okay, that's fine. You can say it's yours.
Right.
But if you didn't create it and there's not enough, and there's only a certain amount of it, and everybody wants some of these things, why should the first person to squat on it and just get there first? Like, I mean, indigenous rights is a separate topic, and we need to be sensitive about that. But just within the world of, someone like two people are swimming to a desert island, right?
Yeah.
They both fell off of a boat. They're both swimming to the desert island. One gets there 10 seconds before him and tells the other one to go drown. I mean, there's no justice in that, right? And that's kind of what we're dealing with here. And when you understand the scarce nature of land, then you need to come up with policies that account for that. The other thing about land is that land increases in value due to its location, right?
Right.
And that location goes up in value based off of the activity of others, right?
Right.
If I own an empty lot right next to Times Square, and it goes up in value, I'm not doing anything to make it go up in value. The activity of New York and everyone in
someone
New York,
else.
right? And so, like, me just having a little hot dog stand there, that's a very valuable hot dog stand.
Right.
But it's not that valuable if it's in Gerlach, Nevada.
Right.
But if someone goes and builds a megacity in Gerlach, Nevada, then all of a sudden my hot dog stand becomes valuable, even though I've not shared anything with the community, right? And that's kind of Georgism in a nutshell. We'll get into the weeds in a bit.
Gotcha. And George does make a distinction between like land improvements, right? And just
yes, absolutely.
Gotcha.
That's a core thing. Do you want to ask that next and go into that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a real estate. Okay. So I have in my hand. My son brought this because he found it on the floor because we were looking at a Monopoly set the other day. So real estate. Okay. So real estate is two things. There's the land, which is this little slip of paper here.
Yeah.
And there's the improvements on the land, right?
Right.
Together we call that property, but they're two completely different things, right? And there's more kinds of improvements than just buildings, but buildings are typically what we mean 98% of the time when we talk about improvements. You can have other things like especially when we're talking about like mineral land, like an oil well, like the oil land with oil on it is valuable. And then if it has a pump jack installed, it's even more valuable. But most of the value is there because of the oil, right? And if you have a tool shed or a garage or a swimming pool, those are all improvements, right? If you have a field and you plow it, the act of plowing the field could be considered an improvement. If you plant crops on a field, the crops could be considered an improvement, and things like that. So.
Awesome. No, I like that, and that distinction is really important. So, prescriptions. So we've got this diagnosis. What does George propose? Like a tax, like land value tax. Like, what's the answer?
Yeah, so there's land value tax is basically the big policy proposal. Basically, the policy proposal that George proposes is that we should figure out basically for every piece of land in America, or just whatever your jurisdiction is, if you want to pass it.
Yeah.
You want to assess land at its full value. You want to figure out basically what it would cost to rent the land. And if you think about like who would ever rent land, well, that's exactly what a parking lot is, right? If you have a parking lot and you just like what is the amount of income you could derive from this place as like a parking lot, assuming it's downtown, right?
Yeah.
And that amount of income is the amount that should be taxed from the site every year.
Got it.
100%. And if it's a residential place, you should tax the land rent, which is the amount that you're able to charge in rent, not because of how nice the house is, but because of how nice the neighborhood is, right? Or the fact that it's a corner lot on a cul-de-sac, or on a waterfront property, right? Like the amount that you can charge because of the land, not because of the property. I mean, not because of the building, right?
Right.
And George says you should tax that at 100%. In actual practice, it's a little hard to get up to 100%, but modern Georgists are like, if you do 85%, that's good enough. And then honestly, in practice, every time land value tax has been done, it's much lower than that in practice, but you get incremental benefits from incremental implementation. It's not one of those things where you got to do it all or nothing.
Gotcha.
But basically, once you do that, once you tax at 100% of ground rent or land rent, which is based of the locational value of the land, you have some really interesting effects, because despite what you might have kind of intuited from your experience with other taxes, land value tax is the only kind of tax you can't pass on to a tenant. It's the only kind of tax that a landlord just has to eat and can't pass on to the next consumer down the line. Like if I tax anything else, if I tax capital or I tax income, you get what you call deadweight loss.
Yeah.
Example is like cigarettes or gasoline or candy. Let's start with candy or hamburgers, anything, right? If you tax, I'll use an example of oil. If you tax oil, out there somewhere, there is an oil well that is right at the margin of productivity, which means they're making a profit margin of 1 cent per barrel of oil or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Whatever is the minimum to
just barely.
$1, $10, whatever is the minimum to be worth it. And if you raise the tax by the amount equal to just what's putting them on the bubble, they're going to shut that well out of production. They'll probably keep the well, but they're going to stop pumping oil, right? And they'll wait for the price to go up or the tax to go away. And then that decreases the supply, and decreased supply but fixed demand means increased prices. And wouldn't you know it, the price goes up by almost exactly the amount of the tax.
Right.
And so what happens if your supply curve is vertical, which means that no matter what you tax this, there will be exactly as much.
Right.
And that only applies to land. It's the only thing in the world that applies to, right? I mean, unless you refer to some other mineral in which we've extracted literally all of it or whatever, some other weird edge cases that are rare in principle. But basically, whenever you have some asset that is 100% fixed in supply or close enough to it, the reason that you have deadweight lost economic activity from taxing something, is because when you tax it, producers make less of it because some of it is no longer productive to make. And there's no land factory that's making land every year.
Right.
So if you tax land, it's not like the land fairy's like, well, better make less. We're planning on making a whole nother Earth next year, but we better wait until there's a policy change, right? We're going to make a couple new Manhattans, but we're just going to have to delay production a while. It's like, no, there's exactly as many San Franciscos and Manhattans and 1600 Pennsylvania Avenues and 902 Linnos as there were before the tax, which means the landlord just has to eat it, right? And that's maybe not so much fun for landlords, but what happens is it causes two things. One is it causes anyone who's holding land just for speculative purposes, which means I'm holding it because I know it'll go up in value, right? I am going to jump off that property like a hot potato because like maybe I was expecting to earn X% a year in increased appreciation.
Right.
Well, this tax is eating that up. So this is now a
It's not
negative
worth it.
asset for me. Throw it on the market. Throwing it on the market increases the amount that is now for sale.
Right.
And because it's now on the market, that puts downward pressure on prices. And so now fewer people are bidding up land who don't intend to use it. And more land is now on the market. And a third thing that happens is it now only becomes profitable to hold land if you're going to do something productive with it.
Got it.
Right. So, like, and all of this has the effect not of increasing the price, but lowering it. Generally speaking, there's some caveats because what it also does is that there tends to it can also cause a land boom to meet the effect. So what it'll do sometimes is that all things being equal, it'll lower the prices. And there's been studies that show this, or at least it's fully capitalized in the price of the land.
Gotcha.
It'll often lead to more efficient development because no one's going to hold an empty lot and make it a parking lot for surface parking
right by Times Square because they know Times Square's
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're gonna sell to someone who's gonna build a really valuable thing to do there, right?
Right.
And then it also leads to less sprawl because instead of going out in the suburbs to buy more marginal land because all of the land in the city center is too expensive,
yeah,
people are going to build more densely in the city center. You're going to get more walkable, dense cities. You're going to get more housing, right? People are going to, it's going to be less efficient to build single family homes and more efficient to be, because another thing is that, remember, improvements and land, there will be marginal land where it's only valuable to have like a small house on it.
Right.
But it's like, if it's like primo land and you got to pay like a land tax on it, you got to build something really valuable there. So you're going to build a lot of housing, right? You're going to build a lot of houses for a lot of people. And here's the other part to it. You untax the building. So property tax taxes the real estate. It taxes the property. Property is land plus improvement. Land tax takes away the building tax, takes away the improvement tax, and leaves only the land tax. So it's like, build as much as you want. You add an addition, we're not going to raise your taxes.
Doesn't matter.
You add a second floor, you build as much as you want. I mean, zoning is still an issue and we need to get into that. But you build as much as you want and we're not going to punish you for it. In fact, that's literally the only way to be profitable is to build something. And you know what is fair is people building something and investing and working hard and getting rewarded for that rather than extracting value out of other people who have worked hard and invested just because you hold leverage over them because you own a scarce resource and they don't because you got there 2 seconds before they did.
Right. I love it. Yeah. I really like that. Has anyone, tried land value taxes like on a big scale?
Yes, a couple of places. So one thing I want to back up and say real quick is that we didn't really introduce who Henry George was.
Right? Oh, yes. Sorry, I should have done that.
Yeah. And you can edit this together however you like.
Yeah.
So who's Henry George, right? So Henry George was a 19th century, we call him a political economist. That's what they called themselves back in the day. And he was immensely popular. One thing that's really kind of forgotten today is that what we now call like around the turn of the at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, there was just a really huge civil unrest, right? We had one of the worst recessions we've ever had back then. They call it the Long Depression, right? And it was worse than the Great Depression in many ways. And it was the 19th century, right?
Yeah.
It's just like everything's terrible.
Yeah.
And basically, people like prices were out of control, like in terms of rents. Like there was massive poverty, and so George was this political economist who developed this theory of land. And he noted that there was a paradox that wherever you have progress, you also have great poverty, right? How is it that we've got all this great progress, industrial technology and economic development, and we also have so much poverty going along with it?
Yeah.
Right. And Marx had his theories, but George had another theory. And he's like, it's because of the capture of land that allows people to extract rent up to the margin of productivity. And George was not the first one to have this idea. He did not invent the philosophy. He is its greatest popularizer, however.
Got it.
Right. Henry Ford didn't invent the car, but he's kind of the father of the automobile.
Yeah.
Henry George is the same way with what we now call Georgism or Geoism and the land value tax, especially. But he did have antecedents. There was some Danish paper I read that was like claiming that land value tax actually goes back centuries into the Viking era, and that there's all kinds of precedent for it. And that's probably true. I haven't checked up on that. But then also, just more importantly, Thomas Paine, an American founder, was an advocate of this. Adam Smith and David Ricardo laid the foundations that George picked up. So Adam Smith, Captain Capitalism himself, and David Ricardo had a lot of the same critiques about landlords. In fact, one of the phenomena that George describes for how extraction of value from land rent works is a theory that comes from David Ricardo called Ricardo's Law of Rent, right?
Oh, nice.
And we'll get into that in a bit. And then the other thing is that the French physiocrats, they were a movement in France. They developed a philosophy basically identical to what George came up with before George. I'm not entirely sure if they knew about each other. But what's so funny is like rederiving the principles of Georgism, like from first principles, just like coming up with the same idea based off of looking at the world, is something that's happened multiple times.
That's a good sign.
And George did it himself, and he was not the first to do it. You know, so in a way, like recreating Georgism while having no knowledge of Georgism is like kind of the Georgiest thing in the world. You know,
that's awesome.
And I'll tell you a really funny example of that sometime about EVE Online, where a economist they hired to fix recessions in EVE Online with no knowledge of Georgism rederives Henry George's land value tax from first principles, and it worked.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So anyway, so going back to your question of has it ever been tried? Well, it's been tried in EVE Online, and it works.
That's awesome.
I'll describe that in a little bit, but in the real world, it's been tried in a couple of places. I'm currently in the process of a big research project to like track them all down and look at them.
Yeah.
You know, so one, there was a couple of little communes in, I think it was Fairhope, Alaska, and Alden, I forget what city. I forget what part of the country. So Fairhope and Alden were kind of like Georgist communes, single tax communes.
Gotcha.
I think they basically experienced mission drift. And so they're not great examples today. Denmark is a really good example of a place that has land value tax. I don't think there's any place that has done like 100% land value tax, completely untaxed property, done it the whole Georgist way.
Right.
But there are places that have approximated at different times. Houston, my own home stomping grounds in Texas, did it in 1911 under the aegis of Houston's first Hispanic mayor, J.J. Pastoriza. He implemented something called the Houston Plan, which was very close to a Georgist scheme where basically you assess land at 100% of its value and you tax it at like, I think it was 75% of the land value, 25% of the building. And no other property. So like no money, no furniture, no cars. Not that they had cars back then.
Yeah.
But like none of that was taxed. It succeeded, at least according to the evidence that we have. It's not enough to do a robust analysis.
Gotcha.
But it was struck down by the Texas Supreme Court because we can't have nice things.
Right, of course.
But those are a couple examples off the top of my head. There's a couple other countries that I don't want to rattle off right now. I mean, I know there's at least 6, but I'm not done doing my research. And then there's also just a more broad kind of cousin to Georgism is just the concept of land reform, right? And so land reform is when you basically just take the land away from the aristocrats and give it to the peasants that are working on it.
Yeah.
It is the biggest missed opportunity in American history where we did not give the freed slaves 40 acres and a mule. Our economic development would have been massive. Like even like if the racist people who had refused to do it were just thinking in their own economic interest of the country, it still would have been a perfect idea to do. And also the racial justice aspect of it is completely like even more pressing. But it's one of the biggest lost opportunities in our country. But land reform is basically like where you just take the land from the aristocrats, and then you just like, hey, peasant, you're working this field as your land now, right? And one of the most shining examples of that is Taiwan, right? And Taiwan had land reform. I believe it was under Wolf Ladiginsky. I'll have to look that up to make sure I'm not confusing that with like Japan or something.
Yeah.
But he was a Georgist economist, and he implemented land reform. Now, land reform is not the same as land value tax. George was not really opposed to land reform. He like had some mild criticism of it, saying that it's like, land reform is good, but the problem with it is that after a couple generations, it's possible for the land to reaccumulate. Right. And so you need something a little more sticky. But I mean, certainly not a bad idea. But that has been a really common way for a lot of developing countries to kind of there's this book called How Asia Works, and it talks about the plan of how to go from kind of a third world backwater to a modern industrial digital economy, and it starts with land reform, right? And so there are places that have done like Georgism adjacent ideas like land reform that have been very successful, and there have been a couple of little places here and there that have done land value tax, but it's not something that has had the continent-wide dominance that say the American model of whatever we're calling capitalism this week, whether it's Keynesianism or Milton Friedmanism or whatever, versus the Soviet model of, you know, whether that's true socialism or not. Like whatever they were doing, whatever America was doing, like we can't say they've not been tried. Like they've been tried for like a whole Cold War's worth of effort. Georgism didn't get implemented to that degree. It's been tried in a couple of places, and there's been some good research papers coming out of some of those places that shows that it does work. Most recently out of Denmark, where there's this massively just beautiful study that shows that land value tax actually cannot be passed on and will not be passed on. Like they just show that it was implemented, we studied it, it happened, super well-controlled study. So yeah.
Nice. And this is kind of a broad question, so it might be difficult to answer, but you know, what's the best critique of Georgism you found?
Yeah, so there's a couple of them, right? So it depends on what angle you're coming from, right? So if you're a Marxist, it doesn't go far enough because the point is to destroy capitalism and any, you know, and all that, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like Mao wanted to murder the landlords. And by the way, Mao's land reforms went really poorly because he destroyed his agricultural basis, you know? You know, George doesn't want to murder the landlords. He just wants to tax them. So if you want to murder landlords, well, Georgism isn't for you. You know, I mean, I know that's unfair to say of all Marxists. I'm sure Marx himself didn't want to murder any landlords.
Yeah.
You know, Marx himself had some critiques of George. So we'll just, instead of putting words in his mouth, we'll just let him use his own words. Marx didn't like Georgism because George had a two-factor model of production. George says the factors of production are three: land, labor, and capital. George says it's labor and capital. And I mean, not George, but Marx says it's labor and capital.
Gotcha.
And Marx basically thinks that land is a kind of capital. And so that Georgism is a sneaky way for capitalists to like tweak stuff on the edges and try to save capitalism.
Gotcha.
Right. And that's Marx's critique, basically, that George isn't a Marxist.
Gotcha.
And then there's other critiques that come from, say, the right. And so on the right, I mean, it really depends on how hardcore you are. Like if all taxation is theft, literally all of it, then land value tax is a tax, so that's theft, so that's bad, right? And I've seen people who take that. I mean, and it comes down to, and now my understanding comes from like, so my background is that I came from a very conservative family. I'm less conservative now, but I'm not like hyper anti-conservative like is popular on the internet, right? And I believe a lot of the values I grew up with, like hard work, investment is good, saving is good, being thrifty is good.
Yeah.
Like, but what really resonated with me with George was the notion of it's like, I'm entitled to the product of my labor.
Yeah.
I'm not entitled to the product of your labor. And George says that basically the current land scheme is a system where people who own the land can extract other people's labor, and that's unfair. Right. And if you don't agree with that and you agree that it's like, hey, I paid for the property fair and square, and now you're going to screw me over. It's like, I'm a homeowner and this is like my only investment. Like, you know, so there's one angle that it's, in my opinion, kind of nakedly self-interested.
Right.
I understand it. I'm not going to judge someone for, that. I will strongly disagree with them. There's other more like less self-interested, more principled objections. One is that, okay, land value tax is great. I buy the argument about deadweight loss, but it's impractical. It can't actually be done.
Gotcha.
And I'm currently doing a research project to see if it actually can be done. And I'm trying to keep an open mind. Like, maybe it can't be done. Like, let's just look at the evidence, and then I'll present the evidence. And so far, the evidence is pretty convincing. And I would say that because I'm a Georgist, but when I write the article, then, people can, tear me apart.
Yeah.
We'll see. And the arguments against practicality is, and these are things I think are fairly salient and worth responding to in good faith.
Yeah.
One is that it's like, okay, well, you say all you have to do land tax is you've got to assess the value of the property separate from the land. But when you buy the property and the land. So how can you say that this isn't just a made up number? And we're just supposed to trust government bureaucrats to do this? This sounds like a centrally planned economy. This sounds like socialism.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that is a valid critique, right? Yeah. And places where land value tax reforms have failed is when they've gotten sloppy with the assessments because it leads to tax results. I believe that the path to Georgism and land value tax reform in America is getting really good at land value assessment.
Gotcha.
And I'm actually taking a course on land value assessment right now from Ted Gwartney, who at the Henry George School, who is a pretty famous within the assessment world assessor who's worked for a bunch of places. He's implemented Georgia's policies in a lot of places, and he talks about all his methods for assessing land. My neighbor actually is a land appraiser, and I can talk about the difference between assessment and appraisal because it's different. And I've been getting some tips from him and learning how they do things. And it actually, in practice, assessors and appraisers actually value land and property separately all the time. My tax bill has two separate numbers. Now, making sure they're accurate requires, some training and some best practices. But if anything, it's easier now than it was 100 years ago in Pastoriza's time. And Pastoriza was able to get it done, with just paper and pen and like horses.
Right.
So like we have modern GIS maps and all kinds of technology and just the ability to like survey our population like never before and do all kinds of crazy stuff. So if anything, assessment is easier and cheaper now than it used to be. And it was perfectly plausible in Georgia's day. It's even more plausible now. The other best critique of it that I can think of is, so like David Friedman brought up that there's a criticism that, if the value of the land is going to be done by government appointed or government elected people, then people with most government connections can basically game the system.
Yeah.
And that's a valid concern. I need to investigate to what degree that happens in practice. But also, I feel like sometimes whenever people are like, okay, well, people will just game the system. That's kind of a fully general critique of any system. You can raise that to any. Rich people will game every system, like literally every system, and they are gaming the current system really bad.
Right.
The critique should not be rich people can game the system or will game the system, because you're right, they can and they will. The question is, can they and will they game it less than the current system?
Currently now.
And the current system is income and sales and capital tax. And they hide that income and they don't report those sales and they hide that capital and they have all kinds of tax shelters. And Google and Amazon are not paying all that much in taxes. And they're doing the double iris with a Dutch sandwich and they're super good at it. And like the money and the capital can hide. The land at least can't hide. And you know what? The assessment can't hide either. So if you do a crappy assessment, it's hard to hide the fact that you've done it if anyone motivated is paying attention.
Right.
You have to do all of your sneaky corruption out in public where everyone can see it on a big shiny map.
Definitely. And it's a lot harder to game.
Yeah, it is harder to game, right? There's less levers you have. It's just like, here's the land, here's how much it's worth, here's all the good reasons it's worth this much, here's all the sales that are happening in the area. That's the other thing, is that the other argument is that land value is detached from like market valuation. And so like some conservatives say we should get rid of property tax and move to sales tax. And like, because property tax is just like made up government evaluations, but sales tax, that's like market, truth, data. And it's like, well, actually like the real test of, if you found me, I think from Astral Codex 10, he's always talking about prediction markets and stuff.
Yeah.
Assessment is effectively a prediction game. I'm predicting what this land will sell for. And so if you do them often enough, it's self-correcting. It's like you just learn from the prices that are happening. So if you do annual assessments, or even biannual, and you just look at the market, you're like, I'm predicting this will sell for this much. It's like, oh, it did within this margin of error. And just keep feeding that back in until we get really good at it. And if you follow the best practices, you'll be good at it from day one. And then the other part of the criticism, though, was that because I forgot my train of thought here all of a second. But like, yeah, sales taxes, are more direct reflections of market value and things. Anyway, so there's ways to keep valuation in tune with the market.
Yeah.
And I think that's less gameable than sales tax. I mean, you can pay people under the table. You can refuse to report your sales, and then also, oh yeah, the other argument that is made, a Texas politician made this to me, was that you need an army of assessors and it's too much government bloat. And the problem with that is that you need an army of enforcers for income and sales tax.
Yeah.
And also, part of that army is the people who have to report their own income and report their own sales. You are passing that cost. You are basically conscripting the whole population to do free labor to report their own income and sales. And they're kind of incentivized to lie to you about it. Right. And then you also have all these penalties hanging over their heads if they don't report it correctly. You can have an enforcement agent to go after individuals all over the place. Right. And then you got to like audit and like do all these checks and stuff. And like no one's measuring the deadweight loss that has on the economy, like of everybody having to hire accountants and like report their income taxes, or the deadweight loss on businesses of having to report all the sales tax and all that. And, not to mention the direct cost to the government of the enforcement agents of that, right? And so it's like you look at a map of the land, and if you get your value from the land, you're done once you've gone over all the land, and it doesn't scale that badly, Like also, the more people we have, like at most, like the more parcels of land we might have, but the amount of land is not going to increase, so it's not going to be a problem that scales all that poorly compared to income and sales tax reporting, which is going to have to scale at least linearly with the population, if not more than that, right?
Right. Absolutely. No doubt. And it seems like, there's so many costs. I think I should have iterated this more in the beginning of the podcast, but just the insanity of like housing prices in the US now. So I saw this stat that in 1960, the median income would pay for 40% of the median house in 1960. Mm-hmm. And now it's it would only pay for 18%.
Right.
And so it's just, a lot of this, I think, explains the appeal to socialism to a lot of young people like Bernie Sanders. It's like, you can't get on the housing ladder.
Right.
Like, you just can't get housing.
Yeah, you can't get on the housing ladder and extract value out of other people, right? So it's like, not only can you not get a place to live, you can't get free money like all the boomers got, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And so it's like, and this has happened before, like socialism's highest strength in America was at the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th, right? And there was a real moment where America was going to go either to the Bolsheviks or the Georgists in terms of which way they wanted to go, right? It was either land reform and land value tax, or it was socialist revolution in America. And a couple of things happened, like Great Depression, Prohibition, 2 world wars, kind of mixed things up a lot, and a bunch of other effects. But one of the other things was we invented the automobile.
Right.
And the automobile was the safety valve that took...
Because you can spread out.
You can spread out. Suddenly, a lot of new land opened up, right? A lot, like it was basically as if, so this is the thing. It's like, you can't make more land, right? The earth has as much land as it's always had, but the amount of land, the productivity of certain land increased. That's what happened, right? And by productivity, I mean like the usefulness of the land. So it used to be like, so what do I mean by productivity of land? Like I work from home, but say I commuted to an office, right? And say I'm commuting to Google, right? If I live right next to Google, the productivity of my house is huge because I can walk right next door and work for Google.
Yeah.
But if I invent the automobile and I don't have to ride a horse to work, and I can work, I can commute to maybe even 3 hours a day if I have to, then the productivity, that sucks. So, but that plot of land still has productivity that's valuable enough to me because I can commute from that place to my job at Google. I don't actually work for Google. I work for myself, but it's just an example. And so the automobile and the railroads and stuff like that, and just increased commuting, pushed out the margin of production. And that's part of Ricardo's law of rent. And that put a huge damper on housing prices and basically bought us a century until now, when and it came with a bunch of other costs, externalized costs like pollution, like deaths on the highway, the fact that that the cars suck and everything's terrible, and we don't have walkable cities anymore.
Right.
And Houston has tons of sprawl,
Yeah.
and that sprawl is planned, by the way. That sprawl is not unintentional; it's intentional. And it happens in every other city too. That was our safety valve out of either a socialist revolution or a Georgist revolution. And
Gotcha.
it allowed us to go through the status quo that we have today. And then all the free land that we took from the Indians, we parceled that out into the American dream for certain categories of Americans, which was, not Black people, not poor people,
Right.
certainly not Indians, right? And so, yeah. And then they built their wealth off of that, and then once the land starts to get monopolized, though, then the prices go nowhere but up.
Right.
And that is the model that we have. And another aspect of Georgism, I'm not sure if I'm as convinced of this. It seems plausible, but I'm always a little nervous about it.
Yeah.
Is that also Georgists claim to be able to call recessions.
Interesting.
And I'm not willing to go to that extreme because I'm just so nervous about being wrong.
Right.
It seems plausible, but basically they believe that land speculation basically extracts so much from the economy that basically they push the extraction to the point just past the margin of productivity where it causes a collapse in the system and then a reset in prices. And it's kind of they claim to have called the last recession, the Great Recession,
Gotcha.
which was so famously housing based, right?
Right. Exactly.
And so they're predicting another one. I don't know when it's supposed to come. It's like 2026 or 2028. I am not personally fully on board that train until I do a lot more research. If they call the next one, then maybe that'll do it for me.
Right.
But I believe that it contributes to recessions, but I also believe that recessions can also be perturbed by so many black swan effects, like,
right.
I don't know, a giant worldwide plague.
Right. Exactly.
That I'm not willing to be able to say I can call it to the year.
Like this
right?
is the thing. Right. That makes sense.
Although I certainly believe that it helps contribute to those conditions.
Absolutely. So I want to move on, but it's still a line. So you mentioned EVE Online.
Yes.
And this is like when I was a kid, I'd play video games. I always thought, and I read the Foundation series by Asimov. I'm like, man, we should be testing like macro econ ideas like in video games. Like this is like a great opportunity. Why is no one doing this? It sounds like someone did this with EVE Online. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, but first I want to talk about what EVE Online has in common with Ultima Online and Final Fantasy XIV, which is the MMO version of Final Fantasy, and also all of these new like crypto-backed metaverse games based off of land ownership. What do they all have in common? What do you think? Digital housing crises. Every single one.
Do they really?
Yeah. Now, when certain I'm writing an article about this right now, but basically, because in my job as a consultant, I'm getting pitches across my desk for what I call digital land grab games, where basically it's a game based off of there's like digital plots of land for sale. Buy them now because they're going to be used up soon, And then like they let you do stuff in game, and I'm like, these guys are going to have digital housing crises. And like if they have dreams of becoming billion-dollar unicorns, they're screwed because their growth is capped, and they're going to be stuck between having to rug pull their early backers by printing more land, more digital land. Or they're going to have to basically be content with the fact that no new players want to join because there's no land for them to use. So let me talk about EVE Online.
Yeah.
So Ultima Online, Final Fantasy XIV, and EVE Online. These are all three MMOs that I've studied that had or have full-blown housing crises to this day.
Wow.
Ultima Online and Final Fantasy XIV have them. EVE Online, at least as of 2003, had solved it. I don't know if the reforms stuck around. I haven't played EVE.
Gotcha.
Lately, so I don't know, but at least as of 2003, they identified the problem, they solved it. Who knows if they made wise policy decisions since? Right. But in Ultima Online in 1999, this was kind of the granddaddy of MMOs. It wasn't the first, but it was the Henry Ford of MMO.
Yeah,
popularized the genre. There was not a free scrap of land anywhere to place your house. I could afford a house. I could buy the blueprint. I'm like, I want to buy a house. There's nowhere to put the house. Where can I put it? And like, you had to go on eBay and like pay someone on the black market to buy a house because people were just putting them down because the land was scarce, right? Yeah. And so what is the difference between digital and physical real estate? Well, in the digital world, there's no laws of physics, right? So like land in a digital world doesn't have to be scarce. Right. Like you can print land like you print a money printer. Like just
Just keep going.
Just print more land, dude. You know, just like print me up a whole other continent. You know,
Absolutely.
But some games decide, and so first of all, there's like an aspect of trust. So for digital land to be scarce in an MMO, it has to be by convention. Like
Gotcha.
nothing, and the same goes for any digital asset. Like any digital asset can be land-like if it fulfills certain properties. So for instance, nothing stops Magic the Gathering from printing 1,000,000 Black Lotuses next year.
Right.
They're not going to do it because we trust them and because it's not in their best interest.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the same sense in which digital land is scarce.
Gotcha.
It's not physically scarce. It's just we know they're not going to make more.
Right.
It is land-like. Digital land is land-like, like truly land-like to physical land when it's necessary to do stuff, when it's a factor of production.
Gotcha.
When you need it to do stuff, it's not just nice to have.
Right.
And there's a sliding scale of land-likeness. So if it confers benefits, that makes it more land-like. If it doesn't do anything, then it's not land-like. If it gives you only soft benefits, that's still valuable. You know, and then the third thing, the really important thing is that it gains value based off of its location in the virtual world.
Gotcha.
Right. You know, and so like I'd mentioned Gerlach, Nevada earlier. Gerlach, Nevada is the place that I believe, as of whenever I Googled it, the cheapest land in America. You can get an acre of land in Gerlach, Nevada for $237. It's in the middle of the desert. It's in the middle of the desert and nobody wants it, right?
You just get it.
Yeah, $237. Buy it while it's hot because it'll be hot for a long time because it's scorching there.
Yeah.
It's the middle of the desert. Land in San Francisco, 2,400 square feet of empty lot in San Francisco will cost you a cool $2 million.
Oh my God.
Right. You know, so don't tell me that it's not location.
Yeah, it's all
location. So in the digital world, when you have land that follows three principles, that it is genuinely scarce or close enough to it, you need it to do stuff, or it confers a bunch of benefits, and it increases in value and desirability, and it's based on its proximity to either population centers or areas of economic activity or other valuable things, then I say it's land-like. And whenever you have a game that has digital land that is land-like, you have a digital housing crisis, inevitably. And that's held up so far in the three big examples that I've really looked into. But I would predict that it would happen in other places like that. And the solution, if your digital land works like that, you have two options. One is to be like, I'm in a video game. I don't got to follow the rules of the physical world. Land, print, or go burn.
Yeah.
It's like you get a land and you get a land and you get a land.
Everybody gets land.
Right. You know, it's like digital land reform, you know, just digital land inflation. Just do it. You know, you can do that. Now, that is not guaranteed to work because it depends because the locational aspect of land matters, right?
Right.
So if you're just printing more Gerlach Nevadas and people still want digital San Franciscos, you know, that might be somewhat out of your control because what makes a San Francisco is everyone wants to be there, right? So it kind of depends on like how your digital world is formed. But generally speaking, like printing more land is an option. The other option is to make land like less necessary, you know, like less benefits occur to land. I call this digital land dilution. And it's what I predict that all the land grab games are going to do to try and fudge out of their housing crisis. They're going to keep the amount of land the same. And then they're just going to slowly nerf it and not really tell you.
Right.
To make it so that the newbies can actually play the game, even though they're not landowners, right? So that they don't have to choose between pissing off the aristocrats or, you know, pissing off the peasants.
Right. The landed aristocracy.
Yeah, seriously, landed aristocracy.
Yeah, no doubt.
Prop 13 established the landed aristocracy in California. Like, it totally did. It's the most un-American thing in the world. America was founded on not having aristocracy. Well, I mean, and then we had a bunch of plantation slave owners who were landed aristocracy. So we were founded on it. But it's contrary to what it should have been founded on.
That's right.
Anyway.
Well, and Lars, I know we're scheduled for an hour. What's your timing like? Because
Let's go for it. Let's do it.
Okay, awesome. Can you talk about what Prop 13 is, just for the audience?
Yeah. So Prop 13. I'm going to answer your Eve Online question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Too. But Prop 13 is a referendum that passed in California, like back in I think the 70s, that basically grandfathers in property assessments. So basically, your assessment doesn't rise.
Oh, that's bad.
If you owned a house before it was passed. And like it can actually be transferred, like that kind of privilege can be transferred. So it really is landed aristocracy that you can just give your noble title to, you know, your allodial heir, right?
Oh my God.
And so it's created this it's just straight up aristocratic. You know, it's just like these people are better than you because of because we say so.
Yeah.
And they get to extract value off your back, and they get to be the government subsidizes them for free based off of your labor because they have blue blood and you don't, because they had housing in 1973 and you didn't.
Right.
And it is the worst, most regressive property law in the country. And it is why values in California are so damn high. Texas has some of the highest property taxes in America. State property taxes, and it's one of the reasons we have actual affordable housing, right?
Wow.
I mean, California and Texas are like kind of on the same scale. I mean, yeah. Texas has a lot of dumb stuff going on. I'll be the first to say that, and I'm not proud of every single regulation or thing we've ever done. I mean, Texas drinks a lot of its own Kool-Aid about how great it is. I mean, I'm proud to be a Texan, and I will fight anyone who wants to poop on me, but I will be happy to criticize my own little brother, / state. Right. But one of the things we have going for us is really high property tax. The portion of that property tax that taxes land is what keeps our land values down, because it's like land speculation is not super profitable in Texas, whereas in California, it literally makes you an earl. Right.
Yeah.
And the portion of the property tax in Texas that taxes the building disincentivizes building, and that's bad. But I'd rather have it than not have it. And I'd certainly rather have it than California's policies. And what I'm afraid of is some politician thinking they're improving things is going to do away with the property tax because nobody likes paying property taxes.
Right.
And just turns us into California, because the only thing worse than high property taxes is escalating rent.
Yes. Absolutely.
And so to get back to EVE Online. Ultima Online had a housing crisis. It's still going. I Googled it because I was like, I remembered it from 1999. Ultima Online's still around. And I Googled it. It's like, let me learn about this historical housing crisis that I remember. Let me find details. Yeah. First thing that comes up is like a forum post from 2018. And a guy is saying, here's some tips for how to solve the current housing crisis. And it's like, presumably it's still ongoing. And you know what his proposed tip was? His proposed tip was to make buildings bigger on the inside than the outside, like Doctor Who TARDIS style. Like, dude, did you just propose the non-Euclidean equivalent of upzoning for density?
I love it. That is awesome.
Which, for those who don't know, upzoning for density is a very common YIMBY proposal. That's like, we need to have more dense building codes. So like, instead of single family housing, we need to be able to build like duplexes and triplexes. So we can fit more people, like make better use of the land, right?
Yeah.
And because it's expensive. So like, that'll bring down prices and increase supply and blah, blah. So anyway, it's like, I mean, there's problems with that idea, but in Ultima Online, right? You know, basically make your little shack a bag of holding the size of a castle.
Right.
But so the housing crisis was still ongoing. I looked into Final Fantasy 14, and I got this guy to like just tell me, Final Fantasy 14 veteran, tell me all about it. Like housing there is like, they do print land in Final Fantasy 14. They don't in Ultima Online, or at least not very often. Final Fantasy 14 land is all shoved off into housing districts, which are kind of like hyperdimensional suburbs.
I gotcha.
So like you got to warp to them from a city to go there. So they kind of like exist over there. And they do that so that whatever problems are happening with housing don't like infect the game world.
Right.
But the problem is you've got, I mean, I could almost like pick up this. Let me see if I can find the picture of the land speculators my buddy was showing me. Okay. Let me get this full screen.
Yeah, totally.
Open image in new tab. View full screen. I don't know how to do anything on the computer. Okay, let me share screen if I can. Can I do that?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So can you see this?
Let's see. There it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you see this right here. It says placard, right?
Yeah.
So this here is an empty lot in a housing district in Final Fantasy 14. This is a person who owns a house. All these people are sitting here. Probably they're all macro bots. They are clicking on that placard because they are sitting there waiting for that placard to go on sale. that land lot to go on sale. And when it goes on sale, it's got a randomized timer that determines when the land goes up for sale.
Oh my God.
And they're going to sit on it, and they're going to sell that land on the black market and hold it out of use for the highest bidder.
Oh,
or they're going to put like just a cheap house on it, right?
Yeah.
So anyway.
That's awesome.
Oh, I have another one that's really good too. The other thing is...
That is a great image.
Yeah. So anyway, F11, how do I computer? I do not know how to computer. But anyway, the other one I want to show you is, I want to show you his house. He has a waterfront property, with fireworks display.
That's awesome.
Which is okay. So let's see. Yeah. So where's the view from Joe's house? Okay, here's the view from Joe's house. Open image, a new tab. Hide my email. Share screen. Okay. So all right. Final Fantasy 14. Right. Okay. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay. So so my boy Joe here, he owns a house on a waterfront property in a housing property, and it's got a fireworks display. If you will open a real estate textbook or an Econ 101 textbook, a firework display is a textbook example of a public good, right? Public goods have the tendency to have whatever investment the government makes in them be absorbed in the land values of the nearby properties. And the fireworks display is a textbook example because it's non-rival and non-excludable. You consuming it doesn't prevent someone else from excluding it, and you can't prevent anyone from consuming it. So if you put a fireworks display in that everybody likes, it makes all the land values go up.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then it's a waterfront property. And we all know from real estate, location, everyone wants to live near the water, not only because it's pretty, but because you can fish in it. So even if you don't want to fish in it, someone else might. So it increases the value of that property. So anyway, I'm going to stop screen sharing there. So anyway, so Final Fantasy 14 has a housing crisis. And so they do print more land occasionally in the hyperdimensional suburbs. But because there's no cost to holding land, there's no property tax, there's no land tax, people just speculate on it and sell the houses on eBay. And they go for more and more and more as the population increases, which is exactly what George predicted. And all of the stuff we know from real estate and theory plays out. Like right down to I was shocked. When he showed me the picture, I was just blown away. It's like, this is so textbook.
Yeah.
Waterfront property with a fireworks display.
That's awesome.
And so like the whole thing with the fireworks display, public goods, there's a theorem called the Henry George theorem that Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz demonstrated that shows that public goods spending gets absorbed into land value properties.
Nice.
You know, and this is just like...
That's a perfect image.
It works out in the digital world by people who are not trying to say anything about Georgism or land or anything. They just stumbled across it by they basically created a simulation of these things happening in the digital world. So EVE Online, that's the buildup. EVE Online had land-like assets, and those assets were factories. And the factories, they existed in a fixed amount. They were created by the company that makes EVE. I don't know I can't remember their name. And they provided them, and they sold them to players, and players would buy them, and you had to use them if you wanted to build ships. If you wanted to manufacture ships, at least in 2003 when the game launched, I don't know what it is now, you needed to hold a factory to build ships.
Gotcha.
And so what happened? People bought the factories and then held them out of use and tried to sell them on eBay for $300 to $900 or $600 or whatever. Right. And you had no way to even know if they actually owned the factory. They were just had a listing on eBay. It was all shady and stuff. Right.
Yeah.
And Raman Shakrazadeh, like, he has this famous Kama Sutra post pasted in 2013 detailing what he did in 2003. So he bought the game the day it started. Like, the servers had already gone online in Europe. So like almost all the factories had already been bought. He immediately raced out to like the furthest like rim worlds or whatever, like out in the edge where like people didn't care as much, and bought the factories there before it was too late. And then he made a ton of money. And he's like, okay, yeah, my theory is confirmed. Basically, the problem is that there's not a holding cost to this asset. And because it's scarce, people are going to speculate and scalp. So you need to impose. And so he writes a white paper and he sends it to the CEO of EVE and says, here's how to solve this problem. Yeah. And you need to add a use it or lose it fee to holding factories, which is going to disincentivize speculation because there's no longer a guaranteed rate of return and you'll probably lose money unless you're building just an F ton of ships.
Nice.
Which is what we want, you know?
Yeah.
And so he did that and they did that and then everything was fixed. And then exactly what he predicted happened. Speculators jumped off of the factories. They put them up on the market. The price went down. People only bought them if they planned to use them. And then the economy started chugging again.
Nice.
And so he solved a recession, a manufacturing recession caused by the factories. Now, if factories could be built by just anyone, then you wouldn't have had that problem because the factories wouldn't be land-like. But they were a necessary factor in production, and they were strictly limited in supply, which made them land-like. And what's so funny is that Raman then goes on to basically brag about how this helped him predict the 2008 housing crisis. And he basically makes the Georgist argument for predicting housing crisis based off of land speculation. And so and then I'm in the comments and I'm like, of his Kama Sutra article in 2013, like, Ramen, if I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, Ramin,
Yeah.
Mr. Shakrazadeh, I understand you right that you basically just implemented Henry George's land value tax, and he's like, what's that?
That's
And
awesome.
and that's just to his credit, right? He goes and looks it up. He's like, yeah, I just looked it up. Yeah, sounds about right.
Oh my God. That's awesome.
Yeah, so he independently re-derived it from first principles because it was the natural and correct solution to the problem he observed, which is not the first time that's been done. I mean, George himself was not the first one to do that. He just kind of gets more credit because he just started this massively popular movement.
It's a big movement. That's so cool. And all of those are such great natural experiments,
Yes.
like which I think is really telling at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Do you think Georgism, you coming to Georgism, does that have anything to do with having this background, from, you experience the Nordic model, right? And then you're a Texan as well.
Right.
Like, so you're kind of in between these two worlds, and you can see, and Georgism in some sense is kind of like the synthesis, right?
So you could
some
say
way
that.
to think about to think about it like that.
You could say that it doesn't actually come from there exactly, because like my dad is like a hardcore American Texan Republican, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And my mom is kind of like, I mean, she doesn't have any strong opinions, right? She's a super sweet lady, but she's not super interested in like policy, right? And so, I mean, I mostly just kind of got my dad's views, growing up. And I did have an undergraduate degree in architecture, right?
Nice.
Which kind of prepared me for urbanism and stuff like that. But the person who was most influential to me was actually my priest. You see, I'm Eastern Orthodox, and I converted in college. I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian. That's what this deal is. My priest was super into Georgism, and also actually a cousin movement called distributism, which goes back to like G.K. Chesterton and those kind of folks. And it's Georgism is kind of a plank of it. Like Georgism is so narrow. Like Georgism is like you can just mix it up like cherry Coke. You can be geo-libertarian, you can be geo-liberal, you can be geo-conservative.
Gotcha.
You can be geo-monarchist if you feel like you must. And so he introduced me to it. And then also there was this writer called John Madai who came and gave a presentation to our school, and he wrote a book called Toward a Truly Free Market. And it has just like it's half about Georgism and other things like that. And that really kind of clued me into it. And once I read it, it was just like, I mean, it's one of those dangerous philosophies that's extremely convincing. So it's like, you start reading it, it's just like, yup,
It's the answer. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was really interesting because it helped me get away around a lot of dilemmas, because like growing up, like with a lot of conservative values, like I really felt, like I was attached strongly to them, but I also like had this like dissonance that it's like a lot of it kind of felt unfair. But then everything has been divided so much between like socialism, capitalism, the only two ways,
right?
The only teams, America, USSR, fight. And it's like that has so dominated the discourse, and it's all about whose team you're on.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, I know I'm not a commie, so I guess I'm a super capitalist, right?
Yeah.
And being Orthodox was really interesting because it's like that also was, and I'd also been taught that there's only Protestants and Catholics,
right?
And atheists,
That's it.
And that those are your three choices, right? Yes. And so like when I became Orthodox, it was kind of interesting because that itself was like kind of like, whoa, I didn't even know that like you read about like, okay, so there's the Catholic Church and there's the Great Schism. Don't pay attention. Who cares about that?
Whatever.
Reformation on the European history,
Yeah.
And so I just like my world kind of broadened, but like my priest is the one, Father Cassian Sibley is the one who really influenced me to become a Georgist. And really, honestly, if I can say so, it's like, it's a way to like understand bring Christianity and economics together for me personally. You don't have to be a Christian to be a Georgist. George, I believe he did believe in God. I don't know if you would describe him as a Trinitarian Christian or anything like that. He never went to church from my understanding either. So he wasn't like, he was religious in a very particular and common 19th century American way, which is, religion's important, but I won't go.
Right.
A lot like my father in that regard. And what's interesting to me was that it's like, for me, like my foundational ideologies. Like I had to pick, like, okay, so like what is my identity? Am I Republican? Am I Christian? Am I conservative? Like what's important?
Yeah.
I realized, okay, I'm a Christian. That's the one thing I'm not going to give up. I can throw away anything else. And like I see things like you shall not muzzle the ox as it treads out the grain. And we're not talking about oxen here. You know,
Yeah.
you allow the stranger to glean from your fields.
Right.
You know, like all the verses about money being this thing that corrupts people, makes them evil, and you have held back the laborer's wages, and those held back wages cry out against you and will throw you into the pit of hell and all this stuff. And it's like, it doesn't seem like Jesus is being subtle here.
Right.
Exactly. One time he reaches out and beats people up is when he's beating up the money changers and the usurers in the temple.
Yep.
It's like, I think he had some opinions about economic abuse.
Absolutely.
And it was really interesting. And the ancient Hebrews had land reform, Jubilee, like every couple of years, you know, and they had right of return. So anyway, talking about the Norwegian thing, it's interesting. Yeah. Norwegians have a right of return, just like the ancient Hebrews did. It's one of the oldest Norwegian laws. It's called odel, and that's probably just the Norwegian word for allodial rights. And what it means is that, like, okay, let's say I'm the oldest, my mom's oldest son. I'm not, but let's say I was. And let's say she was the oldest heir, and she was still owning the farm back in Norway. Basically, it means that if I go off to find my fortune and mom has to sell the land, I have the right to purchase it back at a fixed price, right?
Ah, interesting.
Which makes land kind of a dangerous investment in Norway. Right. It's basically a way to keep land out of the hands of the Swedes and the Danes who've been taking turns conquering us over the centuries.
Right.
You know, and basically it kind of keeps land in the family and keeps it from accumulating in the hands of the local lord, right? It keeps small holding, you know, it's not perfect. It has problems. There's also, we have allemannsrett in Norway, which is every man's right, which is the right to roam. People, you know, if you have undeveloped land, wilderness land, people are allowed to walk across it. You're not allowed to like put up no trespassing signs. And like, people are allowed to walk straight across it. They're even allowed to camp for a day. As long as they take good care of the property and they're good little Boy Scouts and they leave it as just as they found it and they don't litter or anything like that, you can't keep them off your undeveloped land. And so Norway has some Georgist instincts. Denmark is the really kind of Georgist place in Scandinavia. They actually have a land value tax. I'm not sure what the rate is or what the rate is relative to buildings. And I have a beautiful study that came out in 2017. There's been a whole series of studies going back to the 60s about, does land value tax actually work? And like testing, is it really capitalized into the price of the land? Like, does it really just make the landowner just have to eat it and not be able to pass it on?
Right.
And there's a couple of tests that have come out and they've been, you know, varying degrees of strength. And you have to do all these like controls and like squint at the numbers and be like, it's probably right. But, you know, someone's like, well, I'm not so sure because you had to do this and that. And that's part of the problem we call the indigeneity problem, which is there's something that's endogenous to the system and exogenous. 7th grade science fair, independent, dependent variable. So like ice cream sales in the summer, right?
Right.
You know, it's because it's hot that you have more ice cream sales, right?
Exactly.
You know, and that's an endogenous part of the system, right? So like the question is, if you're trying to test land value tax, how do you know that you imposing the tax caused whatever effect you see rather than what caused you to impose the land value tax, right?
Right.
So when you're measuring policy, people do policy for reasons embedded in the system. And the example I'm using in my article is, say I'm Emperor Lars of the planet Lars, right? Sovereign of the Lartians, right? And so one day I go to get off my gilded throne and I go to the giant gilded ruby encrusted lever that sets the prime interest rate. And I pull it and I change it from 1.2% to 0.8%. And all these effects happen in the economy.
Yeah.
And researchers with PhDs are like, ooh, natural experiment. Let's see what happened. And it's like, well, when when the Larsen prime interest rate goes from 1.2% to 0.8%, this happens. But why did Emperor Lars do that? I mean, maybe it's because the economy is really bad. Or maybe it's because there's a bunch of protesters at my door. Maybe I want to distract everyone from the losing war we're having with the Earthlings, right? You know, and maybe those are the things that cause in whole or in part the effects you think are attributed to the interest rate, right? Those are endogenous effects. Exogenous effects is when a giant hyperspace beast just shows up and eats every single manual gear shift car on the entire planet Mars and then disappears. That came from outside of the system and then it caused an effect, and whatever happened afterwards is because of that thing. We call those acts of God, right?
Right.
You love to see it. They come very rarely, and they rarely do exactly the thing you want. In Denmark in 2017, we had a hyperspace land value tax imposition. We're as close to it as we can get. And what happened was the municipal government, for extremely boring reasons, was like, we got all these counties in Denmark. Let's just redraw the boundaries to something more convenient. Shove these counties together, move this county here, like just change the boundaries. Some of them get joined together, some of them get split up.
Yeah.
We're just doing that for boring reasons that have nothing to do with tax policy.
Right.
All of Denmark has a uniform property tax assessment. So property tax assessment across the board is the same. But land value tax versus building value tax is different per jurisdiction. And you just shuffle the jurisdictions.
Oh, wow.
So you have an N of like 250.
Oh, that's awesome.
And you did it for reasons completely unrelated to policy, just for boring, like shuffle all the boundaries.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just like we implemented land value tax in Houston for 2 years before the Supreme Court struck it down. Yeah. And we have nothing to control against. It's we just shifted, like we basically just mind controlled every jurisdiction in Denmark effectively and just told them to raise their land and property values by random amounts so that we could do like regression analysis and all the kind of econometrics I don't understand and just like see what happened and see like what small changes versus large changes and like, and you don't even have much to control for because it's just perfectly like it's not, nothing's perfect, but it's as close to an exogenous shock as you can get. And then it's one of the strongest papers I've seen. There's a bunch of weaker papers like that all show basically the same thing, but they basically you have to take their word that they're controlling for it correctly. Right. And so Denmark is kind of cool in that regard.
Hey folks, there's a brief break here where we lost power while recording. We recorded the second half about a week later, and Lars had a cold, so his voice is a bit deeper, and we moved on to another topic to start the second half. Thanks.
Norway's history as an oil empire and how it kind of resisted the resource curse.
Oh, yes. So Norway's interesting. Now, I am not an expert on Norwegian history. I've just read more about it than most, right? The fact that I'm a Norwegian citizen is just what's gotten me interested in it, right? There's plenty of like non-Norwegians who know more about Norway than me, and plenty of Norwegians too. So with that prefaced, so Norway is one of the few countries that's avoided what we call the resource curse. And the resource curse is typically associated with Middle Eastern countries, but you see it elsewhere too. Venezuela is a good example, both when it was, right-wing and in its current left-wing iteration, and then Saudi Arabia and Iraq and other places like that, just historically, with or without America's intervention. You can say America's intervention has made it worse, and I would agree. But generally speaking, the resource curse is you're a country that is blessed with natural resources, like just tons of natural resources. And the curse becomes that paradoxically, your country's development, like richness, like infrastructure, doesn't get developed precisely because you have this wealth of natural resources. Like I think this also happens in a lot of African countries that have a lot of mineral wealth, for instance. And the curse is caused by the fact that because you have this great base of natural wealth, you create an economy that's based off extraction, and you don't, like, in order for the elites to be wealthy, they don't need to develop like a robust economy, right? All they have to do is just...
So all you have to do is stick a shovel in the ground and dollars fly up. And so you just never develop any real infrastructure, education, or anything like that.
Right. And so a lot of the oil producing countries, like traditionally, like wouldn't have like necessarily a lot of great refineries, like gotcha. Venezuelan oil is like that in particular. You would have like you would just sell crude to the West and Europe and China and whatever, right?
Yeah.
But you wouldn't necessarily like get really good at refining it and stuff like that. And so you can do a couple of things. You can try nationalizing your economy, your oil industry, but that doesn't always work, But what happened in Norway actually is that Norway avoided the resource curse, and they've created a really broad, like the other way to like get trapped by the resource curse is like that resource becomes your whole economy, right? So even if you kind of develop infrastructure, it's based around that. And so gotcha. Your fate is tied to that one resource's place in the market. So price goes up, you're doing good. Price goes down, your entire economy is bust. And I mean, and that's happened to Venezuela over and over again. right? And other countries. Like, it's not just Venezuela. Like, it's easy to like over index on like Chavismo and Hugo Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela, but it's like they have other problems besides that, and they had a lot of the same problems when they were right wing related to the resource curse too, you know. But the way Norway avoided it is kind of a really interesting story, because it was an Iraqi guy. Let me find his name. Yeah, it was an Iraqi guy who's now a Norwegian citizen. And he's like been awarded the Medal of St. Olaf, you know. He's awesome. He's a knight of St. Olaf, because he basically like in many ways responsible for our country. Let me look up what I can see. Yeah, I can find out who this guy was again. Iraqi, Norwegian, oil. His name should come right up. Okay, his name is Farouk Al-Qasim. Alrighty, nice. Let me look up his Wikipedia page. So Farouk Al-Qasim, Knight of the Order of St. Olaf, is kind of the savior of the Norwegian economy. So basically what happened is that he was born in, I think he was from Basra, Iraq. And he was educated, he studied in England, petroleum geology, according to Wikipedia. And I believe he married a Norwegian woman. And his son had some rare medical problem. I can't remember what it was exactly. And the only place that he could get treatment for that was in Norway. So they went back to Norway. And while he was there, presumably started, working and stuff. And this was in the 60s. And around then, let me make sure about the timeline. Yeah. In the 60s, in 68. And while he's there, he was, the Ministry of Industry hired him as a consultant, and he was analyzing North Sea exploration. Like, as a lot of, just for the audience, the North Sea has one of the hugest oil reserves. Like, there's this huge oil reserve there. And he realized, holy crap, Norway is about to dive headfirst into the resource curse I saw happen in Iraq, right? Where politically connected cronies benefit off of the resources, or foreign countries come in, like American companies, and they keep all the oil wealth for themselves. And like the countries just becomes like this tenant to this foreign empire, right? Like, Norway needs to be the master of its own destiny. This is their oil. It's clearly like they've got the claim to it. We need to do things right. And now is the time to strike. And he wrote a white paper along with some colleagues and sent it to the government. And he said, this is the plan. And Norway followed that plan to a T, and they avoided the resource curse. And so some people might correct me on some of the details I'm about to say, because I haven't, it's been a while since I read all this stuff. Yeah. But the basic sketch of it is he recommended that Norway nationalize their oil industry. And that's where a lot of people stop. There's more to it than that. So it is actually kind of a private public partnership. Statoil, right, is the name of the Norwegian oil company, is Statoil. Later it's been changed to like Equinor now, and they've like reformed it a little, and like the policy is like moved, but that was the original idea. But it wasn't just that we're just going to nationalize the oil industry, because a bunch of people have done that and not evaded the resource curse. Yeah. What he did is essentially not too far off from a Georgist principle, which is that it's like nobody created the oil, right? So we don't want any private industry to really benefit from just being able to own the oil, right? Right. That is the people's oil, so long as we can credibly say that the Norwegian people have claim to these oil fields. That's the people's oil, right? But what private industry is really good at is investing in capital and investing in development methods and stuff. So we are going to subsidize the ever-loving heck out of oil exploration and discovery, but we are going to tax the ever-loving heck out of oil extraction. Nice. So this is kind of a weird way to do it if you're not used to this, but what it means is that it's like, what is the cost of going out and looking for oil and finding a new well? Well, the Norwegian government will pay for almost all of that. So why not do it, right? Yeah. And then they're going to tax, I don't know what the rate is, but it's like huge. It's like, I don't know, 80, 90%. It's like up there of what comes out the pipe. But it was basically free to set up the pipe, including all of the expensive tooling and capital and like all of the exploration. And I'm not sure exactly what's included with that. I'm not sure if like sinking the well is part of that, but it probably is. like, and all the tool design and the research and all that, that's all subsidized by the government. It's like, hey, private industry, we will fund all your efforts to like cover your costs to like go out and like find the oil.
Right.
But then the people get to own the profits of it. So you get to keep some so that it's worth doing in the first place.
Yeah.
And it was often like a bunch of private companies are working with. I forget which one it was that Farouk was specifically like working with in his time. But and so that kind of tax is a natural resource tax like that. I think it's called what is it called? A severance tax. I need to double check myself that that's what it's called. But when you like tax the removal of depletable natural resources from a site, that is called a severance tax. And that's something Georgists tend to support. And it's and this has been, and then what did Norway do with all this oil money? We plow most of it into, I forget what it's called, like it's a Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, right? And they invest that in stuff. And that's I think it's kind of like an endowment. Like we don't, it's our seed corn. And so like, we're not eating it actively. We're like, but we use it to kind of like the interest from it to help fund the Norwegian, the Norwegian welfare state. And you've heard like turn of the century and stuff, like all these scientists were like, the Industrial Revolution is going to make it so that we can get the same amount of work done. We're going to work less time, right? You know, and they've actually realized that in Norway, right? It's like Norwegians live for vacation, right? You know, like whenever it's winter, all the birds and all the Norwegians go to Spain, you know, like that's just how it is. Like Norwegians just like live for their vacations. And it's like, you can criticize that if you want, but I think it kind of beats like I don't remember the last time I really took a vacation here in America, you know,
Right.
Because yeah, I mean, it's just what you got to do. And, you know, I think there's a lot to be said for that. And I think like a lot of people who are interested in the Nordic model kind of focus on a lot of superficial aspects of it and don't understand the details that make it work. Like one thing, just as a quick aside, is one of the things that makes the Norwegian model in particular, the Nordic model talks about all the countries, but each of them is slightly different. What makes Norway and a lot of the other Nordic countries work is scale. Like you'll sometimes hear like right wingers talk about, well, if we had a homogenous population full of white people, then
exactly
everything would be perfect. And I'm like, yeah, well, okay, you're missing the point. Like what makes Norway work is that it's like it got a population smaller than Houston, right? And so there's not that much distance between the people, you know, and like whether they're native ethnic Norwegians or Iraqi Norwegians or whatever, you know, there's less distance between us. So Norway functions more as like a really high trust society. And when you have a really high trust society, like you can do things so much more efficiently because you don't need to have tons of bureaucratic checks on things. And the government can't get that complicated. Like Norway's effectively a municipal government on American scale. Like the city of New York is more like complex than Norway. I mean, Norway's like more spread out, but still, you know, and there's like less layers between everything. It's like a good example is like there's a Norwegian school that like expats can like send their kids to like make sure they know Norwegian. And like I rang it up because I was just interested in inquiring for my kids, and like their process is like, just go ahead and talk to Shashti and she'll hook you up, you know, like that's their like enrollment process is talk to Shashti, you know, not like fill out this form or fax a PDF or anything like that, you know.
That's super interesting. So you talked about size and why governance is so good in Norway, but do you think there's anything else? I mean, it's just unimaginable to me, even in like our local municipal government here, for them being as competent as, you know, like the Norwegian government. Like, you know what, we're going to avoid the resource curse. This is a great idea. Read this white paper. We're going to implement this, and we're going to invest all the money for the future in a sovereign wealth fund.
I mean, part of it's cultural, right? It's like part of it's like, and then part of it's also like, your local municipal government is not sovereign, right? Like they're part of a larger, like they take orders from people above them and people above them and people above them. And then also it's like, it's just easy to forget like how easily transferable certain policies are across cultures. Like what counts for right wing in Norway is really interesting. like in Norway, the right-wing party is the pro-EU party. Norway's not a member of the EU.
Oh, really?
We're a member of a lot of the treaties, so we're kind of sort of
Yeah.
like practically speaking, we got to kind of do what they say, but we're not a full member of the we're not a member of the EU in any like official sense.
Yeah.
And like that's very intentional. And like the party that pushes for it is the Conservatives, because that's the pro-business stance from a Norwegian context.
Ah, interesting. Super interesting.
Whereas in UK or America, like being against these like international agreements or whatever can be seen as like they're big enough economies on their own for that to suddenly become like a conservative position, right?
Gotcha.
I mean, Norwegian conservatives are probably like slightly to the left of Bernie and, you know, all the other things they stand for. But like also, but like also like Europe is weird in certain ways. Like, I mean, Norway until very recently had a state religion, which is like, despite the fact that most people there are very secular, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in America, like you have much more religiosity, but you actually have like separation of church and state. Right. And so it's easy to misunderstand these things. But like going back to localities, like I think the fact that Norway's sovereign
really matters.
I mean, we still gotta do a lot of what the EU says, even though we're not EU members. So sovereignty means a little less when you're tiny, but still, I mean, I think it counts for something, and also the fact that you can't spread out like you can here in America, and that has some implications, right? Like if I were to drive 100 miles and they all start speaking another language, like that's, even if I can speak English there, and most Norwegians speak English, I mean, it's still like that's a huge barrier, right? Yeah. So you don't settle too far from home, and the effect of that is that I'm related to like the whole county of where most of my family is from, like, and so there's these really thick, just like, I don't know what the word is, just like, I mean, like we're very atomized in America. Like we don't have strong connections to each other. That's one of the reasons that, like, compared to Norway, we're much lower trust society. I mean, we're much higher trust than, say, like, I don't know, like Russia maybe.
Yeah.
But we're still lower trust compared to them because we don't have those strong ties that bind. We can move across the country to get away from our parents, and then and I think that counts for a lot. So if you want the magic Nordic pixie dust, part of it has to do with, not so much that it's a homogenous society of white people, which is kind of a myth because we actually have more immigration than people realize. But it has more to do with the fact that it's high trust, that it's a small population that's sovereign, and everyone kind of knows each other and bumps into each other all the time, right? And then stays in one place and doesn't like just move, because now you're in Sweden and, we make fun of Swedish people and they make fun of us back, but it's cool.
That's great. That's super interesting. I want to pivot a little bit, and you don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but
go for it.
Eastern Orthodox. You're Eastern Orthodox, correct?
That's correct.
Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I know earlier in this show you mentioned, it's almost like a third way. You know what I mean? Like, usually you hear you could be Catholic, you could be Protestant, and like that's pretty much it. How did you, come to the religion, and what made it appealing, I guess?
Yeah, like I didn't intentionally set out to become a person who collects like a bunch of like statistically unlikely adjectives for myself. Like Norwegian, Texan with Tourette's syndrome and narcolepsy, Eastern Orthodox Christian. I mean, like I wasn't trying to like just make myself absolutely easily demographically pinpointed in a government database, even though I seem to have achieved that. But yeah, so I grew up Norwegian Lutheran, and by that I mean Church of Norway Lutheran, right?
Gotcha.
My dad was I call him born again Republican. I don't think he'd be insulted by me saying that. Like he believes in God. He's very but he's very conservative, and I mean he was a lot like Henry George. Like he thought religion was important, but like didn't go to church, right?
Yeah.
And then my mom raised me and gave me my basic religious values, and she was raised in the Church of Norway, which is so the head of the Norwegian church is, in fact, the king. That's not a power he really exercises. He doesn't really act like a super bishop.
Right.
You know what I mean? But so like in Houston, there is a Norwegian, don't giggle, seamen's church. That means like sailors' church, right?
Gotcha.
So, tend to find those in all the big port towns, and they become like kind of Norwegian cultural hubs. And
Interesting.
so I didn't go to an English speaking church service in America until I left for college, really.
Oh, wow.
So
That's
like
cool.
the services were in Norwegian. I was confirmed in the Norwegian church when I was 15,
Oh,
like
nice.
the Lutheran quinceañera, but also
Nice.
for boys when I was 15, and I just grew up with that. And so that's a liturgical tradition, right?
Yeah.
Especially Norwegian Lutherans. But they're also like kind of mainline Protestant. So like you see the same things happening within that denomination that you see in like the Anglicans and the Presbyterians. Is like these fights between the traditionalists and the modernists and all of that. I was pretty insulated from that because it was a foreign satellite church, right?
Gotcha. Right.
Attendance is actually much higher in Norwegian churches outside of Norway than they are back home in Norway.
Oh, interesting.
Because if you want to go hang out with Norwegians, that's the only
place to go. Right.
Either that or ExxonMobil, right?
Yeah.
And so I was raised in that, but I didn't my mom became more than nominally religious kind of late in life. Like she started off fairly just kind of, well, you're Norwegian, that's what you do, right? And then she like fell in with a bunch of evangelical friends and like faith became a much more authentic and important part of her life, kind of like by the time I was a teenager. And myself, like I grew up mostly agnostic, Lutheran, like most good Norwegians.
Right.
And then, but then like kind of had a little bit of a conversion experience towards the end of high school, taking it a little bit more seriously, but also just kind of bumping around and being confused by a lot of things. And then in college, there are no Norwegian Lutheran churches to go to. So I just went to whoever. And that was kind of like going into an American church for the first time, even as someone who's lived in America my whole life, like an American Protestant evangelical church was like, what is this?
Right. What is going on?
Guitars and like hands in the air.
Yeah, right.
And like, I mean, because also like my experience was also Norwegian. And like, if you've known someone from Minnesota, it's like a pretty good approximation of what their ancestors were like, and it's like, oh, yes, how are you doing?
Right.
Like your expressiveness and everyone's in my face and testify.
Right.
All that. And anyway, so that was kind of weird. Like I was kind of into it for a little while, but then like I kind of scratched the surface and started asking questions and, not getting very good answers to them.
Yeah.
And also just the Protestant experience, not to knock on all Protestants, but the American evangelical Protestant experience is kind of pretty ahistorical. It's like they're pretty sure about what they're not, but they're not always sure about what they are, and they don't necessarily know where they've come from. And then what was so funny is like one year it was Easter and I was in college and I was going to go to services, like because they had evening services for the college students, and they canceled Easter. They had the morning service for the old people, but they didn't have it for the student service because they expect all the students were going home. And I hadn't paid attention to that. Yeah. So I was like, what am I going to do? And so there's this Greek girl in my dorm and she's like, well, on the Eastern calendar, Easter's next week because they're on a different calendar. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll go check out what your church is, Yeah. And it was a really weird experience because the church I went to, it was in the back of an insurance building because the parish was so small.
Yeah.
We called it the Orthobox.
That's awesome.
And there was this priest there. I mean, all Americans. There were some Russian parishioners, but it was an American priest. And I just started asking questions. I never really left, right? And then whenever someone asks me like, what made you change your mind? Why did you become Orthodox? Like, I asked that of my priest once, during my catechism, because they make you actually they won't let you convert right away. Like you got to do a whole process.
You got to actually, yeah.
Because they're really they really want to make sure you know what you're getting into.
That's cool.
And so I asked him how did you decide? Because he was actually a missionary kid for a Baptist preacher in Africa, right?
Yeah.
And so he said, I was like, so how did you decide I was correct? And he was like, I concluded it was correct. Right. That was why I changed. And I was like, oh, I don't think I'm going to be able to top that answer.
Yeah, no.
So, I mean, it's just I'd always been interested in historical Christianity and the Orthodox claim, and I believe them, that they basically are historical Christianity. I mean, it's the form has adapted to local cultures along the
Right.
way, but there's a direct line of succession from them to the back without any major changes and things. And um, I was like, okay, this is what I kind of been looking for. It makes sense. And there's not much more to the story than that. It's not like it matched my lifestyle or aligned with any of my political values. In fact, kind of the opposite, but it was just convincing. And so I was like, well, I guess this is what I'm doing now.
That's
And
super cool.
yeah, so this is actually my baptismal cross.
Nice.
And yeah, and our parish is still pretty small. We're in a house now instead of a tiny like
Nice.
insurance building. But it's been really interesting, and it was my priest, in fact, who introduced me to Georgism. So
Oh, cool.
he was, I mean, he takes a lot of like, now you'll have super right wing Orthodox priests, and you'll have super left wing ones. Like, in this country, they're just Americans, right?
Right.
So but he very much drew on the ancient Christian tradition, and kind of took him through what I feel are its natural conclusions, which is in support of things like Georgism, right? Like,
Yeah.
you go through and like, if you read the Old Testament, like the Hebrews are pretty like obsessed with fairness to the stranger and orphans
Right.
and widows. And like the book of Ruth is all about, it has like the subtext to the whole book of Ruth is like land policy,
Yeah.
and I just found that fascinating. And it was something I hadn't really thought about before. Like the only act of violence Christ ever commits that's written down is like to like money changers and bankers,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
Which is hilarious, And so my priest is kind of like into environmentalism and stuff. And he's a big fan of Wendell Berry. And it was really interesting just talking to him and learning from him. His name is Father Cassian Sibley. And it just kind of changed my perspective on a whole lot of things. Now, if I had gone somewhere else, like, I found my current political and economic beliefs very congruent with my religious faith. There are other Orthodox Christians who are very right wing and will just give you the standard like Republican line,
Right.
But I'm telling you that I feel like this is kind of a natural outgrowth of my beliefs. Like there is a related movement to Georgism, which is called distributism.
Yeah.
It's not identical, but like they're very compatible. And this was actually something that was very popular among Catholics at the turn of the century.
Oh, interesting.
Like G.K. Chesterton, for instance.
Gotcha.
Right. And so like Orthodox are not Catholic, but we see eye to eye on a couple of things at least. Not the whole Pope thing and a bunch of other stuff. But that kind of, hey, maybe the poor matter. And I have some very generous evangelical friends I don't want to cast shade on, but like very, very much different from like the whole like religion exists to serve the conservative American movement.
Right.
Something very different from that. And like G.K. Chesterton's favorite quote that I love is, the problem with capitalism is not that we have too many capitalists, but that we have too few, right? And I think it was John Calvin, another person I don't have much in agreement with, but one thing I really like that he said, was it John Calvin or was it Francis Bacon? Okay, it was Francis Bacon who said, riches, when they are, he said this in like old Elizabethan English, I'll just paraphrase, riches, when they lie up on a heap, are like dung. They just create great stench. But when you spread them out evenly, it creates much fertility and fruit, And so so just like being connected, the same thing that kind of drew me to Orthodoxy, which was looking back in history, like, okay, what are the principles I say I have, right? And reaching back into history, what is the natural conclusion of those principles? Like the same thing kind of worked on me with Georgism, even though like a lot of my Georgist friends are just all over the map religiously, like they're Quakers or atheists or agnostic, or, some of them are Orthodox like me, some of them are Catholic, Protestant, everything, right? But in my particular case, the same, like looking back to history and trying to learn the lessons of history is also what kind of brought me to Georgism, is because, when you really go out and look there's all these things that never get talked about, because history, it's not like history has been like censored or edited so much as like the only things we talk about are the things that drive our current conflicts.
Right.
And we forget about what people used to care about. Like most people only know of William Jennings Bryan as like the anti-evolution guy in the monkey trial.
Yeah.
Like they don't recognize when you say, do not crucify this country on a cross of gold, which is what his actual legacy is, you know? And then it's like you say bimetallism and like people are like, what? But you say Scopes monkey trial and everyone knows what you're talking about.
I got that.
You know? And that's kind of
great point.
I believe in evolution, for the record.
That's great. And that's a really good point as well, that, you know, what we talk about is really driven by our partisan conflict and the cultural war, and we just ignore anything that really doesn't fit in the narrative or doesn't score points.
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting. Yeah. So anything else you want to talk about, or any other points you wanted to raise?
One more, and it's another one of these like complete right turns, but video games. You spent a lot of, so you built one, you've been successful with it as well, which is it seems like a really difficult thing to me. Like I just see how competitive the video game market is. You know, like I know Xbox, like Game Pass, it's like $5 a month, and it's like every title in the universe, it seems like, is available to you. So how do you think about being successful in the video game industry and creating new games?
Oh man, it's tough. There's this probably apocryphal story about how you're allowed to convert to Judaism, at least in this one sect, right? So like this probably apocryphal story is that a proselyte goes up to a rabbi and says, please, I would like to become Jewish. You know, please receive me into, whatever sect of Judaism he's trying to enter. And the rabbi says, go away, kid. And he comes back again. He's like, please, no, I'm serious. Please I want to become Jewish.
Yeah.
And the rabbi says, go away. You're not serious. I don't want you. And he comes back a third time. And then the rabbi says, all right, you passed the test. You're serious about this.
Yes.
Welcome. You know, we'll start the catechesis.
Yeah.
Right. That's how I feel about anyone who comes up to me and asks me, how do I get into video games? Right. Like,
right.
You almost want to actively push them away, because the only people who should be working in the video game industry are people who like really know what they're getting into, right? And I just gave a presentation in Moscow about this, actually. The big mistake is that there's not one games industry, and there's actually multiple games industries. And knowledge of one industry doesn't necessarily prepare you for another.
Interesting.
It's because we define games expansively, right? An airline flight safety video is a motion picture, but is it film? No.
Right.
We don't call it film, even though it is a moving picture, right? And we don't consider whoever makes airline flight safety videos as part of the film industry, you know. But almost anything fun you do on a computing device, almost everything gets labeled as a game,
right?
And then we draw a big circle around that and call that the games industry, and it just gets huger and huger and huger, and it's like 30 different things. And as a good example of this, there's this game all the kids play called Roblox, which is its whole universe.
Yeah, it's massive.
As big as it's its own industry all to itself. And some people in the games industry, which is to say my corner of the games industry, like literally discovered it like yesterday. I'm like not even kidding, like yesterday.
Oh my God.
Like they came to me like, Lars, what is Roblox? Yeah. Right? You know, and this is despite them working on PC and console games for like 15 years. Right. Yeah. And so anyway, what is my point? So the games industry is very difficult. I'll just speak in generalities because I could do a season of podcasts on this topic.
That's awesome. You should. It'd be really interesting.
Yeah, maybe I will. But the basic premise is that the basic truth of the game industry is that every kid wants to make video games, and there's an endless supply of 20-year-olds.
Yeah.
And the results of that are predictable, which is that there's a lot of burnout. There's a lot of not really investing in the next generation because they're going to come to you anyway.
Right.
Honestly, I hate to like cast shade on my colleagues or anything, but especially at a lot of the big companies and even some of the indie ones, you know, there's a lot of abuse and there's a lot of exploitation, and there's a lot of workers not knowing what they're worth. And so basically for the same skills, you will make less money and work worse hours and have more stress and more anxiety in the video game industry than if you were to go make tax software for dentists.
Gotcha.
Right? Boring software is where the money is, kids. Go make tax software for dentists, right? You know, I mean, I've been told as much by VCs, you know, that it's like, that's where you want to make easy money, invest in tax software for dentists. If you want to take a huge risk, invest in video games. And so making money as like an independent creator is very hard.
Yeah.
Like, and it basically involves like you have to be on your game as a designer and a programmer and all of that stuff, whether that's you or you putting together a team.
Yeah.
And then you need to really keep your thumb on the industry and like identify new changes and basically like change your career, like make major shifts to your career every 6 months to a year.
Gotcha.
And you can already see the problem because the average game takes 2 to 3 years to make.
Yeah.
Right. And so like how can you adapt?
You're trying to hit a moving target.
Yeah. I mean, especially if you're making, it's just so hard to do. And so what I always see with a lot of the indies who survive, indie by we mean like independent developer.
Yeah.
A lot of them inevitably become publishers, right?
Gotcha.
Like they have a successful game and then they kind of exit the rat race because that's the only way to survive long term, you know? And I mean, that's what happened with me. I became a consultant, right? You know, instead of in the gold mines, like I'm now helping people sharpen their pickaxes, right? And like working for the more established people,
right?
You know, and hopefully helping investors from throwing their money away. I mean, I'm not ashamed of it. I think I provide a lot of value, but it's like, it's really rough out there. And like we talk about, I mean, like people complain about platforms like Steam, and full disclosure, I've worked for them for like a year. I mean, also full disclosure, I've also heavily criticized them, you know, and they've never like retaliated against me or anything.
Yeah.
But like even them like taking 30% of every transaction, which everyone, you know, in my mind rightly complains about, that's like nothing compared to other places like, you know, just how locked down Apple and Google have the whole app store.
Right.
Because in addition to taking 30%, they also control who gets featured in a much more total way. And like, I mean, I've written a lot of pieces about it. And then like Roblox, like the amount that their creators get paid out is kind of a pittance. And then Roblox is so interesting because they've closed the loop because like my generation, we fantasized about making Nintendo games, right? And then there was a 10-year gap between us playing games and us being able to get the skills, connections, money, and training and hardware, rare, bizarre hardware, you know, in like 1990 to be able to create the games we loved.
Yeah.
This generation of Roblox kids are playing Roblox games with their friends, and then they aspire to make Roblox games, and then they go on to do so like tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so by the time they turn 18 and ready to enter my industry, they have 5 to 10 years of Roblox experience, perhaps even developer experience in Roblox, and maybe no interest in joining the regular industry. Yeah. And so like I sometimes say like Roblox is the Pied Piper sent by God to punish the game industry for its sins of not investing in juniors in the next generation.
Right.
Right. And like Roblox has just taken them, right, for better and for worse, you know? And anyway, so game industry is super weird. It's not like, it's also one thing I think is interesting is like the game industry is like very self-critical, at least on the bottom level. Like you hear a lot of criticism about the game industry, and like this can like make it seem like it's a particularly bad industry. And we have some like really bad stuff going on. Like if you're looking at all the stuff coming out of Activision, it's like not good. Yeah. But I think it's also important to like keep things in context. This is not to defend the industry because I criticize it all the time, but like oil and gas is like, not only are they kind of destroying the planet, but also like, have you been to an oil and gas conference? Like you think games have a boot babes problem and exploitation of people? Just like, just wait until you've got just a bunch of old guys who don't have anyone woke doing journalism and don't care what they say. Right. You know, and this is not supposed to be like a whataboutism, like, well, at least we're better than the oil and gas industry. Yeah. I'm just saying it's like, you know, like the game industry has a lot of problems and we need to own up to them and we need to be better. We absolutely do. And we're not literally the worst industry in the world. That's a very low bar to clear. Yeah. But I think we've cleared it. And we're responsible for less murders per fan than soccer, you know?
Right, exactly.
Also a very low bar to clear that we shouldn't give us too much credit for. Right. You know what I mean? Like, Yeah, I mean, if you have any particular questions about the game industry, I'm happy to expound on them. But basically, it's a tough industry. If you
Yeah.
want to be creative and like creatively fulfilling,
Yeah.
that's really hard to do at the same time you're trying to make money.
Right.
Because
Right.
you also have to figure out how to make money, and then by the time you figure it out, it's obsolete, and you got to figure it out again. And
Yeah.
that's just crushing. Like you have to be like at the top you have to be like in the top 1% of people skilled
Right.
at like both making games and knowing how to monetize them today before everyone else figures it out and it shifts again. And it's just
just really difficult.
And go ahead.
And how did you think systematically about finding the $20 bill on the sidewalk so you created Defender's Quest, you were successful at it. Is it one of those things where, you're just, you're clearly, I'm assuming you're a lot smarter than a lot of people trying to do it, right? Which clearly, I don't know. But is there other things systemically, I guess?
I mean, I'm also a lot luckier, right? So, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily a lot smarter because, I mean, I know people way smarter than me who don't succeed. And either that means smartness doesn't matter as much as you think, or it means luck matters a little more. There's some people who are like, it's all luck, and it's not all luck. You can get better. I think part of it is I'm probably more arrogant and confident than a lot of people. I mean, I also have whatever degree of privilege is afforded by, net privilege from being white that is not canceled out by having Tourette syndrome or whatever, you know what I mean? So like, so there's that, but also just, but not every white guy succeeds. In fact, most of them don't. So it's got to be more than that. I had good timing, and I did see an opportunity in the market. The way I succeeded was that at the time, the Flash games industry was really huge at the time. There were Flash games.
Okay, gotcha.
And what I did is that I leveraged, at the time, there were very few people who were applying the shareware model to Flash games, right? Gotcha. Everyone was just making money off of licenses, right? Where the company pays to put their logo on your game and you get like a couple $1,000.
Yeah.
And so I was like, what if I just ask the customers for money and I give them a huge ass demo, not like a really restricted demo, but like a huge one.
Yeah.
Like 3 hours, and it's an RPG. And then it like also at the end, it like saves your save file. So you can export it to your computer and it's like, here's your save file. Buy the game and you can like see the next half of it. Yeah. And it was like story driven and it ended on a cliffhanger, but it was like still really satisfying. And then we connected that up to our own site. We weren't even on Steam, and you could just like download the full version. And something like 75, 80, 90% of our traffic came from these two Flash portals, Congregate and Newgrounds. So I know the strategy worked. And that was what got Steam's attention at the time, back when you couldn't just get on it for free. You had to convince them your game was successful enough. And so I did find a $20 bill on the ground. Yeah. But I also was lucky enough to notice it and also confident enough to go after it. Gotcha. And no one else had really tried that strategy at that time. I mean, Shareware had done it before 10 years ago, 15 years ago, right? It was the oldest strategy in the book, but I just applied it to the world of Flash games. And now that model is obsolete because Flash games are gone and you can't do it anymore. But now Flash games have been replaced by HTML5 games. And there recently was a game that used this exact same model and succeeded, called Shapes.io. They are like Factorio. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's a game where like you make a big factory, right? And so it's a refinement of Factorial. It's a little simpler, like has some other affordances to make it more appealing to its own crowd. And then they released it as a web game. And then they later had an upsell to Steam, right? And so they were leveraging the fact that I can't get enough traffic and discovery on the main portal. So I'm going to get it where discovery is currently cheap on the web. And especially but that has a lot to do with timing, because like right now, Flash just died. So an entire generation is like, you can play games on the web, right? What? And then that'll probably get saturated and then more people will try it. And then the value of that will go down. But, by the time you hear about a strategy, it's usually too late to capitalize on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. And, it's a crazy, crazy game. No pun intended. So before I let you go, are there any video games you gift to people that you recommend?
Video games that I recommend that people play. Well, the irony of making games for a living is that you'll never play one again. So geez, what have I been playing lately? Lately, there's a type of game that I like to play a lot. And that is a kind of game where I call them boring old dad games. And they're the kind of game where I can load it up really quickly. It's not going to take hours to download.
Right.
I'm going to be able to play it for a little bit, probably not fail,
Yeah.
and make something like progress.
Nice.
I have something to show for my precious 45 minutes of game playing a week,
Right.
between my 3 kids and my chores and my job, right?
Yeah.
And one that's pretty good for that right now is actually a game made by a friend of mine called T-30. It's available on Steam. It just launched. It's a city builder where you only have 30 minutes to build a city.
Oh, nice. That's
you
great.
have to evacuate the entire Earth in 30 minutes. And 30 minutes represents like a year or something.
Yeah.
And so you got to get them from 60s era rocket technology to the future or whatever, and build up the economy and get as many people off the Earth as you can in 30 minutes.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then do it all over again. And it's procedural and stuff. And,
So
it's
cool.
that ticks all the boxes for being a boring old dad game for me.
Right.
It's the kind of game I can actually play and it's it's kind of low stakes. It's I see how well I did and I learned how to do better and maybe unlock the next set of things or whatever,
Yeah.
So it works for me.
Super cool. Super cool. I love that. Well, Lars, where can people find your work? And do you have any parting thoughts? I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah. So, you can find my work at fortressofdoors.com. It's a fortress of doors, it's kind of abstract, but that's my blog. And I post updates on my long in development Defender's Quest 2, as well as my thoughts on the game industry and economics and stuff. I write for Game Developer Magazine, which was previously Gama Sutra. You can tell why they changed the name.
Yeah.
So I have an article out in Game Developer about digital real estate and the policies there.
Super
and everything.
Cool.
And any kind of parting thoughts? Yeah, I would say that the whole philosophy of Georgism, it is not just a one weird trick, because it actually or we would have just put it everywhere by now. It actually does take some work to implement. And I do think the secret to Georgism is assessments and localism.
Gotcha.
Right? That's its weakness and its strength, because everyone else is fighting over the national electoralism. We need to get the president, we need to get the Congress to do anything. And the other party's fighting just as hard and spending just as much money. So you're just raising each of your own costs together. And then the secret shadow party captures them both to make sure that they're both in favor of never withdrawing from Afghanistan, and other things like that. And what I think is the actual way forward for Georgism, what's nice is that you don't need to control the whole government to make some progress and prove that this is a good way to do things. You can implement it at the local level, depending on your state laws, right? There's a nasty clause in the state constitution of Texas that prevents it. But you can still make progress. If you just, and it has to do with assessment. If you can get the assessments officers to see things your way, or even elect your own people to be assessors,
yeah,
you can make a big difference. For instance, most land values in America are chronically underassessed. So even if you're laboring under the yoke that says property taxes cannot be split rate, you've got to tax buildings and land together at one rate, you can't tax them separately. If you can just fix all of the assessments where land is really undervalued, you're effectively raising the land value tax, and you'll start to see incrementally, partially, the benefits that are predicted by land value tax, just because land is chronically undervalued almost everywhere. And Ted Gwartney has a lot of writing and speaking on this subject. And I believe the evidence backs him up. So, if you can start in your local area and also worry less about who gets to be the state senator or the lieutenant governor, and more about who gets to be your local tax assessor and appraiser,
that's super interesting.
Something that I looked it up on local elections. It was something like a margin of 2,000 votes in my area.
Oh my God. Actually doable. You could actually flip that.
Yeah. And nobody cares. Nobody cares about it at all. I think a bunch of them run unopposed. Right. Yeah. In Texas, it's all about winning the Republican primary. Right.
Right.
Because it's a one party state.
Yeah.
But and there's a way to pitch this that is palatable to conservatives. And there's a way to pitch this that's palatable to liberals, that is right in line with all of their principles. To conservatives, it's hey, isn't it kind of unfair that if you build something, you're penalized for it? Hey, isn't it kind of unfair that you don't get to keep the money that you worked hard for? you know? And then to liberals, it's like, hey, isn't it kind of unfair that, you know, the land which nobody made, like someone squats on it? And to the average renter and worker, hey, isn't it unfair that the rent is too damn high and it just keeps getting more expensive? You know, there's a way to pitch this to just about anybody that is not spin, but just understanding what they want and need. And I think that's the way forward. And the weakness is if you do a bad assessment game and your assessments get out of whack, it doesn't matter how much control you have and how strong your land value tax is. You'll have a tax revolt and you'll deserve it. So, like, I think Georgism lives or dies at the local level with local organizing and a focus on getting the assessments to work, which modern technology makes it possible. And they did it in 1911 without any of it. So that's kind of my feelings on that. For anyone who accuses us of just being utopian and like impractical, you know, those are the concessions I'll make, but I also see them as a source of strength.
Right. Well, and, you know, Lars, I think, you know, this is the true $20 on the sidewalk. It's a lot more than $20, $20 trillion. It feels like on the sidewalk for, you know, American growth and even growth more broadly in the world. That and I think the appealing thing about it is if you can get the model to work on the local level, it's easy, it's straightforward to copy. You know what I mean? It's a fairly simple thing. This is not rocket science. And
I think like right now we just need awareness that it exists. One interesting anecdote I'll leave you with. And this is something I just found out yesterday from my 4th session of Ted Gwartney's assessment class. Is Ted Gwartney, who's this, I keep referencing him, he's a property value assessor. He's a Georgist. He was one of the co-signers of a famous letter to Gorbachev, at the fall of the Soviet Union. And they wrote him a letter and they exhorted him, please do not give in to all of the experts who are going to flood you from the West, the Harvard educated economists who are going to make you privatize and sell the country down the river. Please, like, this is your chance. Like the country is crumbling. Like, you've decided communism is the way forward. Please consider like serious land reform and land policy that can enrich your country. And they listened to the Harvard people, unfortunately, and everything went down the tubes. But they also sent that letter to a bunch of satellite states. One of them was Estonia, and Estonia listened. And I haven't done a deep dive. I just found out about this yesterday, so I haven't done a deep dive on Estonia's policies. But I've always known as a Norwegian that Estonia has been pretty up and coming, because it's like, wow, here's all these like
you hear about it, right?
Estonian immigrants in Norway, and like my uncle married an Estonian woman, and it's like Estonia. Like what something's going on there. And apparently like they've been doing really well, much better than their neighbors, and they've had a lot of these Georgist policies because they listened to that letter that Gwartney and a bunch of these other people wrote. And I think that's a really interesting story. And I'm going to go and I'm going to like bone up on Estonia and see like how much there is there. But I just think, you know, the more people know about stories like that, the less objections like, well, this can never be implemented anywhere. It's like, actually, it's been implemented in like 5 places.
Right.
You know?
No doubt. And very successful places like Estonia. So one more question. Practically, if people want to learn more about Georgism, are there any like think tanks or policy places, shops they can go to learn about how to like affect change within their local community? Right.
So there's a couple of places. There are 3. So like besides just like, I mean, if you want to know what Georgism is, you know, there's my book review you can pass them to, which is basically like Progress and Poverty in many fewer pages. But like if you actually want to get involved, it's a mouthful of a German word, so I'll have to spell it for you offline so you can.
Okay, we'll put a link in there.
It's the Schalkenbach Foundation. I think.
Nice.
It's this old, like centuries old foundation that like goes back to the old single taxer days in the 1900s, I think. And it continued to this day, and they promote like Georgist activism and thought and like research and stuff. And then there's also the Henry George School of Social Science, which does a bunch of the YouTube videos and also sponsors the class I'm taking from Ted Gwartney.
Okay, cool.
So those are 2 good sources to look up. And then a third source is not explicitly Georgist, but is very much moving in that direction. And it's, okay, I'm gonna have to Google it real quick here. It's
all good.
Association of Assessors International. It's the assessment group, International Association of Assessing Officers.
Nice.
So the land value, this is the organization that Gwartney is a part of, and they do a lot of research on like, what is every Canadian province and American states like policies on assessment, and how do they look on a map, and how are they different? And then like, what do we think are our best practices? And I asked Gwartney at the last session, are these guys like, have they absorbed Georgist ideas as just like the best things to do? And he's like, they're not like officially Georgist. They're moving in our direction and more coming to recognize that the kind of policies I'm always pushing for are in fact the correct ones. But of course, as assessors, you have to like follow like you're duty bound to follow your local jurisdiction's rules. So
Yeah.
like they're always going to be an organization like that, but they do a lot of training and education. And the more Georgist minded people get involved, the more like this organization can kind of like help be a part of that just through, because a lot of it isn't, a lot of like Georgist ideology is just good sense. And right. Assessment officers like, yeah, you want to accurately assess land and you want to accurately assess property. Like, why wouldn't you want to do that?
Yeah.
Like that's the job. We care about doing a good job. And so, yeah, the International Association of Assessing Officers, the Schalkenbach Foundation, and the Henry George School of Social Science, both their website and YouTube and their Zoom classes that they offer are all excellent resources.
Super. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Lars. I really appreciate you taking the time. I've learned a lot.
Thank you so much. I will always take anyone up on an offer to bore them to death with my with the things that I'm into on the internet. But, I really feel like, there's that, there's like that criticism that it's like, okay, it's one weird trick, it's utopian, but it's like, you look through history, there's been one weird tricks, scurvy, vitamin C,
yeah, some lemon juice and, yourself.
Yeah. And it's like, the diagnosis is not simple, right? But once you figure it out, it's like a lever put in the right place can shift the entire world. Removing the Broad Street pump handle ended the cholera epidemic.
Yep.
Like there's at least locally, right? Small things can have a big impact, and it's all about knowing what is the ground causes of everything. And anyway, I'm still doing research to make sure it's all right. And I haven't just been taken in by a very convincing philosophy, but the more I read, the more I'm convinced. And when it's all out there, people can kick the tires all they want and tell me what I'm wrong, and I'll listen to what they have to say.
Yep. And while your research just on the video game angle, I think is an ingenious way to get to it. It really is.
I wasn't expecting to find it there, honestly. It was kind of shocking to me because digital land doesn't have to be like physical land, but they choose to make it that way, and then it behaves like it does in the real world.
That's super cool. Awesome. Well, thank you, Lars. We'll have to have you back on to talk if you find anything else.
Yeah, sure. Anytime.